Fairfield County was the kind of place people thought they knew. A sleepy southern community, surrounded by pine trees and two-lane highways, where Sundays meant packed church pews and Friday nights meant football under the lights. The sheriff was more than just the law. He was the face of tradition, of order, of a world people believed was safe because it never seemed to change. Sheriff Marcus Langford wore that role like a badge of honor. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a stern jaw and a uniform pressed sharp as a blade, he was the man people trusted to break up bar fights, escort high school homecoming parades, and show up in courtrooms with the authority of the law behind him. To the outside world, he was the definition of strength. Neighbors described Marcus as the kind of man you could set your watch to. His wife, Ruth, sang in the church choir. His two kids, both grown now, had gone on to college with his proud smile in the stands. In every campaign he ran for re-election, he reminded the town of the same things: faith, family, discipline. He spoke against drugs, against violence, and, quietly but firmly, against what he called lifestyles that threatened the moral fabric of the South. People clapped. They nodded. They voted. Marcus stayed in power for nearly 20 years. But what no one in Fairfield County knew was that the sheriff carried a secret heavier than any badge. Behind the starched uniforms and the public speeches, he lived with a gnawing fear. A fear that one day, the mask would slip, that someone would notice the way his eyes lingered too long when they shouldn't, or that his late nights at the office weren't filled with paperwork at all. For years, Marcus managed it. He built walls around himself so high that even his own family couldn't climb them. He became an expert in silence. Until one night, when the silence broke. The story doesn't begin with a police call or a crime scene tape. It begins in the woods, on a dirt road locals only used to hunt deer or fish in the creek. At the end of that road stood a small log cabin built decades ago by deputies as a weekend retreat, a place where off-duty officers could drink beer, grill burgers, or run training exercises. It was county property funded by taxpayers, but no one paid much attention to it. No one, except Sheriff Langford. For Marcus, that cabin wasn't just a rustic hideout. It was the one place where he didn't have to be sheriff. It was where he could be a man with a secret, one that would eventually cost another man his life. In small towns, people whisper, and when whispers turn to rumors, reputations shatter faster than glass. Marcus knew this better than anyone. His entire career was built on an image of law and order. So when his private world threatened to collide with the public stage, the sheriff who preached morality faced a choice: step into the truth or bury it so deep no one would ever know. But burying the truth doesn't make it disappear. Sometimes, it leaves behind something darker, something that demands to be uncovered. And in the summer of 2019, Fairfield County would learn that even the man wearing the badge could bleed, could lie, could kill. When a local man vanished, suspicion turned in directions no one wanted to believe. Search parties combed through woods where children once played. A family begged for answers that seemed just out of reach. And every trail of evidence led to one haunting conclusion: the sheriff himself knew more than he would ever admit. Because hidden in that cabin, on county land meant for trust and fellowship, lay a secret so explosive it would not only destroy a career, it would expose the sheriff as a hypocrite, a murderer, and the keeper of a double life that no campaign slogan could ever save. What happens when the man who swore to protect the law becomes the one who breaks it in the most unthinkable way? What happens when the face of safety hides a truth so dangerous it ends with a body buried beneath the very institution meant to uphold justice? This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about fear, about what lengths a person will go to keep their mask intact, and about how a hidden love, a forbidden affair, and a cabin in the woods led a sheriff from the badge of honor straight into a courtroom, shackled and disgraced. By the time Fairfield learned the truth, it was too late. One man was dead. Another man was on trial. And a community that believed it knew its sheriff finally understood. The most dangerous secrets are the ones that live closest to home. Daniel Reyes wasn't the kind of man people in Fairfield County paid much attention to. He was quiet, polite, and made his living with his hands, fixing broken porch steps, sanding down furniture, repairing fences that leaned after storms. He wasn't born in Fairfield. He drifted there from Texas, chasing steady work and the promise of cheaper rent. Folks knew him as the guy who kept to himself, the one who could turn a warped doorframe into something that looked brand new. But behind his soft-spoken demeanor and strong carpenter's build, Daniel carried something most in town would never guess. He was the sheriff's secret. It started almost by accident. Years back, when the sheriff's office was renovating a storage wing, Marcus had called on Daniel to do the labor. He liked hiring locals, men who wouldn't charge the county too much. On a muggy afternoon, Marcus wandered through the half-finished hall with his boots clunking against the plywood floor, checking on progress. He caught Daniel crouched over a workbench, sweat glistening at the back of his neck, sawdust clinging to his hair. For a moment, Marcus felt something he hadn't let himself feel in years. A jolt, sharp and terrifying, like someone had yanked back a curtain he'd been holding shut his entire life. Marcus told himself it was nothing. Just respect for a job well done. Just a flicker of recognition. But weeks later, when he found an excuse to drive out to a different project Daniel was working on, he realized he was already crossing lines he could never admit to anyone else. Their first real conversation was about wood, pine versus cedar, how long each lasted in the humidity. Daniel laughed at the sheriff's stiff jokes, and Marcus felt the kind of warmth he hadn't felt with Ruth in years. One beer turned into 3, and the cabin in the woods, owned by the department, rarely used, half forgotten by everyone else, became their meeting ground. At first it was just conversation, late-night talks with the sound of crickets and cicadas buzzing outside the walls. Then, slowly, it became something more. For Marcus, it was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. All his life, he'd built a reputation on control. He arrested young men for bar fights, lectured teenagers about responsibility, spoke at church about family values. Yet here he was, sneaking away like a guilty teenager, his heart racing every time Daniel's hand brushed against his. He hated himself for it, and he couldn't stop. Daniel was different. To him, the affair wasn't just about hiding. He wanted honesty. He wanted Marcus to admit, at least in private, who he was. He wasn't naive. He knew the sheriff of a southern county wasn't going to walk down Main Street holding another man's hand. But he also wasn't willing to spend the rest of his life as someone's shameful secret. The tension grew over months. Daniel would tease him. "Sheriff, you spend your life telling folks not to lie. But look at you." Sometimes he said it with a grin, sometimes with frustration. And every time, Marcus felt the sting. He'd bristle, retreat back into the authority of his badge, reminding Daniel that no one could ever know. At the cabin, their worlds collided. The log walls soaked up every argument, every whispered confession, every stolen kiss. Marcus told himself he deserved this. Just one thing for himself, a relief from the crushing weight of expectation. But when he drove back into town, past the church steeple and the courthouse square, guilt slammed down on him like a hammer. Daniel, on the other hand, started to grow restless. He was 34, still young enough to want a future, too old to waste his best years waiting for someone else's courage. He saw couples at the diner, holding hands over plates of eggs and bacon, and wondered why he couldn't have that. Why he had to be the secret, the shadow, the lie Marcus lived when the uniform came off. One night in late spring, after they'd been meeting for nearly 2 years, Daniel pushed harder than ever before. Sitting on the old leather couch inside the cabin, he looked Marcus dead in the eye and said, "I can't do this anymore. If you won't even admit to yourself what this is, why should I?" Marcus snapped, defensive. He reminded Daniel of what was at stake, his marriage, his reputation, his career. But Daniel didn't back down. "That's not my problem, Marcus. That's yours. And one day, the truth's going to come out whether you like it or not." The words lingered like smoke. For Marcus, they weren't just a threat. They were a vision of everything he feared. The newspaper headlines, the whispered gossip, the stares in the church pews. He imagined Ruth's face, his children's shame, the county turning its back on him. In that moment, Daniel wasn't just the man he loved in secret. He was the match that could set fire to Marcus's entire life. And yet, For all the fear, Marcus couldn't let go. He kept coming back, kept hoping Daniel would cool down, that things would slip back into silence. But Daniel's patience was gone. Each visit to the cabin grew heavier, the air thick with resentment. Their intimacy turned into arguments. Their laughter turned into silence. To outsiders, Marcus was still the untouchable sheriff. At Rotary Club luncheons, he shook hands and smiled. At Sunday service, he bowed his head in prayer. But the truth was, he was living a double life, stretched so thin between the man he pretended to be and the man he was behind closed doors that someone was bound to break. And as the summer of 2019 approached, Daniel made a decision that would change everything. He told Marcus he was done being invisible. He wasn't going to hide in the woods like a dirty secret anymore. If Marcus couldn't be honest, then maybe the world needed to know the truth for him. Those words landed like a death sentence. Because for Sheriff Marcus Langford, it wasn't just about love. It wasn't just about desire. It was about survival. And when survival collided with exposure, the sheriff was about to make the choice that would turn a hidden affair into a nightmare and a cabin into a crime scene. It was the first week of July, the air so heavy with heat that even the pines seemed to sag. The kind of summer night when the crickets sang loud, the cicadas droned like static, and every breath felt like it came through damp cotton. Sheriff Marcus Langford pulled his county-issued SUV onto the dirt road that led to the cabin, headlights cutting through the blackness. He had the windows rolled up, the air conditioning blasting, but sweat still clung to the back of his neck. His stomach twisted as he gripped the steering wheel. Daniel had asked, no, demanded, this meeting. The text was blunt. We need to talk. Tonight. At the cabin. There is no room for negotiation, no room to delay. Marcus read it over and over, each time feeling the ground beneath his carefully constructed world start to crack. When he stepped out of the SUV, the night hit him full force. The smell of pine and damp earth, the sound of frogs croaking by the creek. The cabin sat in a small clearing, its windows glowing faintly. Inside, he could see Daniel's silhouette moving. A bottle of whiskey rested on the table, 2 glasses already poured. About time, Daniel said when Marcus walked in, his voice edged with impatience. He was barefoot, wearing a plain t-shirt damp with sweat, eyes sharp and restless. I've been waiting. Marcus tried to keep his tone steady, his sheriff's authority bleeding into his words. Daniel, it's late. What's so urgent it couldn't wait? Daniel didn't waste time. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and said the words Marcus had dreaded for months. I'm done hiding. If you won't tell the truth, I will. The sheriff's jaw tightened. Don't start this again. I'm serious, Daniel snapped. I've wasted 2 years of my life waiting for you to be a man. And what do I get? Lies. Excuses. A key to a cabin no one's supposed to use. I'm not your dirty little secret anymore. Marcus's chest tightened, heart pounding against his ribs. Do you have any idea what you're saying? Well, that would do. To me, to my family. Daniel cut him off. To hell with your family's image. What about me, Marcus? What about my life? You get to go home to your wife, your kids, your big house. I get to sit alone, waiting for the scraps of your time. I'm done. Marcus reached for him, maybe to calm him, maybe to plead, but Daniel shoved his hand away. No, don't touch me unless you mean it. Unless you're ready to stop lying. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Outside, a breeze rattled the trees, but inside, the only sound was the faint hum of the old refrigerator in the corner. Marcus felt the walls closing in. Every headline he'd imagined, every whisper in church pews, every re-election campaign shredded to pieces by the truth Daniel held in his hands. Then Daniel said the words that lit the fuse. If you won't tell them, I will. Tomorrow, I'll go to the paper. I'll go to Ruth. Hell, I'll stand in the middle of Main Street if I have to. Marcus's vision blurred with panic. He saw not Daniel, but the end of everything. His badge stripped away, his family destroyed, his name turned into a punchline. Fear twisted into anger, and anger turned into something darker. Don't, he growled, voice low and shaking. Daniel stood his ground. Try and stop me. The gun was always there. Marcus carried it like a second skin, holstered at his hip. In the chaos of that moment, it felt less like a choice and more like a reflex. His hand moved before his mind caught up. The metallic click of the safety echoed in the cabin. Daniel's eyes widened, a flash of disbelief, then defiance. "You wouldn't," Daniel said. The shot tore through the cabin like thunder. A single crack, louder than the cicadas, sharper than the night. Daniel staggered back, a dark stain blooming across his chest. His glass of whiskey toppled to the floor, shattering against the wood. He gasped, eyes locking with Marcus's one last time, then collapsed against the couch, sliding to the floor. The sheriff stood frozen, the gun trembling in his hands. The room smelled of gunpowder and spilled liquor. Daniel's body twitched once, then stilled, his blood soaking into the cracks of the cabin floorboards. For a long moment, Marcus couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The weight of what he'd done pressed down on him like the humidity outside, crushing, inescapable. Finally, instinct kicked in. Training, procedure, the habits of a lifetime. He holstered the weapon, crouched beside the body, checked for a pulse he already knew wasn't there. His hands shook as he dragged Daniel's limp form across the floor, leaving a trail of crimson that glistened in the dim light. Behind the cabin, a small shed stored firewood. Marcus yanked open the door, the hinges screeching. He shoved the body inside, covering it with a tarp, scattering old logs and bags of lime used to keep snakes away. The smell was already rising, copper, sweat, whiskey. He gagged but pushed through, slamming the door shut as if he could lock away the crime itself. Inside the cabin, he tried to clean. He wiped the table, mopped the floor, picked up the shards of glass. But blood has a way of seeping, of staining deeper than we can hold. A faint smear remained on the couch, a dark droplet caught in a groove of the floorboards. He told himself no one would notice. He told himself he could make it disappear. But nothing about this would ever disappear. Not the body hidden in the shed. Not the bullet lodged in Daniel's chest. Not the fact that the cabin, the place he thought was his refuge, belonged to the county with records and logs and keys checked out through the sheriff's own department. Marcus locked the cabin and stumbled back to his SUV, his reflection pale in the driver's side window. For years, he had lived terrified of exposure. Tonight, in one panicked moment, he had chosen the darkest kind of exposure imaginable. He had traded the risk of humiliation for the certainty of blood. As he drove back into town, the sirenless night pressing in, Marcus whispered to himself the same lie over and over. No one will ever know. No one will ever know. But deep down, he already understood the truth. Secrets don't stay buried. The next morning, Sheriff Marcus Langford woke before dawn. He hadn't really slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Daniel's face staring back at him, mouth half open in shock, the blood spilling like a shadow that wouldn't fade. He sat at the edge of the bed in his tidy suburban home, Ruth still asleep in the next room, the faint hum of the ceiling fan above. To anyone else, it looked like the start of another day in Fairfield County. But Marcus knew the world had already shifted, tilted into a place he didn't recognize. His uniform still hung pressed in the closet, badge gleaming in the morning light. He put it on with trembling hands because wearing it was second nature, muscle memory. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was suiting up as the very man people expected to protect them, even as he carried the weight of a body hidden in the woods. By mid-morning, Marcus was back at the cabin. The July sun baked down hard, the air buzzing with insects. He parked his SUV deep enough off the road so no passerby would notice. The moment he opened the shed door, the smell hit him, sickly sweet, metallic, already seeping past the lime he'd scattered. Daniel's form lay twisted under the tarp, a grim reminder that the sheriff hadn't just stepped over a line. He had obliterated it. He grabbed another bag of lime from the county storage closet, hauled it to the shed, and dumped it over the body. Dust clouded the air, clinging to his skin, but he kept pouring until Daniel's face vanished beneath a chalky shroud. It was an old trick he'd seen in crime reports, a desperate attempt to speed decomposition, to erase the evidence time itself might reveal. Still, even as he worked, Marcus knew it was a losing battle. The cabin wasn't his to control. That fact gnawed at him. Deputies rotated through there for training weekends. Sometimes hunters from the department signed the key out just to spend a night away from home. Records were kept, who used it when for how long. And even worse, Marcus himself had signed the log the night before. His name, his signature, was the last line in the book. He hadn't thought about it in the heat of panic, but now the weight of it pressed down. Back inside the cabin, he scrubbed at the floor until his knuckles burned. He dragged the couch over the bloodstain, hoping no one would look too closely. He sprayed cleaner until the air stank of chemicals, but the smell of iron still lingered. Every streak of red he wiped only seemed to bloom again, as though the wood itself was determined to hold on to the truth. When he finished, he poured himself one of the remaining glasses of whiskey, downed it in a single gulp, and smashed the bottle against the sink. The shards scattered, one slicing a thin line across his palm. Blood mixed with the sting of alcohol. He stared at it, numb. By the time he left, the sun was high, and the forest was alive with sound. Birds called overhead. Squirrels darted through the underbrush. The world seemed too normal, almost mocking, as if nature itself didn't care that a man's life had just been swallowed by silence. Driving back into town, Marcus rehearsed his cover story. He told himself he'd say Daniel had mentioned leaving, something about a job in Nashville or a move back to Texas. He would float the idea that Daniel had simply walked away, no ties to anchor him. A drifter. People would believe it. Men like Daniel always drifted, didn't they? That's what Marcus told himself, gripping the wheel until his knuckles went white. But Daniel wasn't a ghost. He had a family, a sister in Houston who called often, a few friends who knew his routines. And within 2 days, when no one had heard from him, the first missing person report was filed. Marcus played his part perfectly, too perfectly. He shook his head with solemn concern, promised his deputies the department would put resources into the search. He even stood with Daniel's landlord, promising to find out what happened. But beneath his calm exterior, panic churned. He knew every question, every lead, risked unraveling the fragile story he'd spun. At night, Marcus drove out to the cabin again and again, sometimes just sitting in his SUV at the edge of the clearing. He checked the shed door, adjusted the tarp, dumped more lime. Each visit only deepened the risk of someone spotting him. But he couldn't stop. It was like standing guard over a landmine only he knew was there. Then came the detail he hadn't counted on. Cameras. Weeks before, the county had installed motion-activated trail cameras near the cabin's entrance, part of a conservation program. Marcus had approved the budget himself. He'd forgotten about them in his panic, but now the thought clawed at his mind. If anyone pulled that footage, what would they see? His SUV arriving late at night. The sheriff slipping into the woods. The sheriff leaving hours later, alone. The walls were closing in, and Marcus knew it. He thought of torching the cabin, burning it to the ground, but the risk of arson investigation was too high. He thought of moving the body, but the July heat had already begun its work. Lifting Daniel's corpse would leave trails no cleaning could hide. Every option narrowed, until all that remained was to wait. Wait, and Prano got too curious. But prayer was never going to be enough. Because the truth about small towns is that nothing stays hidden for long. And as Fairfield County searched for Daniel Reyes, one by one, the clues Marcus thought he had buried began to surface. Detective Carla Hughes had worked missing person cases before, but something about the call from Daniel Reyes' sister stayed with her. The woman's voice cracked on the phone, her words urgent. He talks to me every other day. He wouldn't just vanish. Carla wrote it down, the way she always did, routine at first. Adults disappear all the time. They get tired, run off, decide to start fresh. But Daniel's sister didn't believe that for a second, and neither, deep down, did Carla. The first step was always the same: retrace the last known movements. Daniel was last seen 2 nights earlier at a small gas station just outside town, buying a 6-pack of beer and a bag of chips. Security footage showed him smiling faintly at the cashier. Nothing unusual. Then he drove off in his old Ford pickup. The truck turned up parked outside his apartment, keys still in the ignition, wallet still on the passenger seat. That was the first red flag. Carla started knocking on doors. Neighbors said Daniel often left early for jobs, sometimes worked late into the night. But one neighbor, a retired schoolteacher, mentioned something odd. She'd seen Sheriff Langford's SUV parked outside Daniel's place more than once, late at night. Carla frowned when she heard it. The sheriff? Why would Marcus be visiting a carpenter after hours? She jotted it down but didn't press too hard. Not yet. Marcus had been her boss for nearly a decade. He was the law in Fairfield, the man people trusted implicitly. Still, she tucked the note into her file. 2 days into the search, Carla and her team started canvassing rural areas where Daniel might have gone. That's when she remembered the cabin. It was county property, officially listed as a training retreat. Deputies rarely used it, but Marcus often talked about keeping it in good condition. She pulled the sign-out log, a dusty binder kept in the records room. Flipping through the pages, her stomach tightened when she saw the last entry, July 3rd. Sheriff M. Langford. Interesting, she muttered. The next morning, she drove out to the cabin herself. The dirt road was overgrown with weeds, but tire tracks were fresh. She parked a few yards back, walked the rest of the way in silence. The cabin looked ordinary enough from the outside, windows shuttered, door locked. But as she circled around back, the smell hit her. Faint, acrid, unnatural. The kind of smell she'd only ever encountered on homicide scenes. Her eyes landed on the shed. A rusty padlock hung from the latch, newer than the hinges it held. She jotted it in her notebook, heart thudding. She didn't break it open, not without a warrant, but she knew. Every instinct told her what was behind that door. Back at the office, Carla pulled traffic cam footage from the county's new conservation program. The trail camera near the cabin's entrance had been recording all summer. She clicked through grainy stills until her breath caught. There was Sheriff Langford's SUV rolling into the woods at 10:47 p.m. on July 3rd. At 2:14 a.m., it rolled out again. No other vehicles were logged that night. Her hands shook as she printed the images. The sheriff wasn't just connected to Daniel. He was the last known person to see him alive. The next step was delicate. Carla couldn't just accuse Marcus outright. He was her superior, her boss, the highest lawman in the county. But she couldn't ignore the evidence either. She started quietly, pulling Daniel's phone records. The last string of texts before he vanished were telling. Messages to a contact saved only as M. The final one read, "We need to talk. Tonight. Cabin." It was enough for a judge to sign a warrant. On July 10th, a search team descended on the cabin. Reporters hadn't caught wind yet. It was just deputies, forensic techs, and Carla, who stood with her arms crossed as they pried open the shed. The smell poured out, choking the air. Flies buzzed in a frantic cloud. And beneath the tarp, pale and bloated in the July heat, lay Daniel Reyes. The scene told its own story. A gunshot wound to the chest, close range. Residue on his shirt. The autopsy would later confirm what everyone already suspected. He'd been shot with a .40 caliber pistol, the exact make and model carried by Sheriff Langford. When the body was rolled out, Carla looked at the cabin again. To anyone else, it was just a log building in the woods. But to her, it was a stage where the sheriff's double life had come crashing down. He'd thought he could hide his secret here, but the very fact it was county property sealed his fate. The cabin didn't belong to him. It belonged to the institution he had served and now betrayed. Within hours, word spread like wildfire. Deputies whispered in hallways. Townsfolk caught snippets on scanners. By evening, Fairfield buzzed with rumors. The sheriff was involved. The sheriff was guilty. The sheriff had killed his lover. When Carla finally sat across from Marcus in the interrogation room, he tried to play the part he'd worn his whole career. Calm, commanding, in control. He denied knowing anything about Daniel beyond occasional handyman work. He denied being at the cabin, even when she slid the trail camera photos across the table. His eyes flickered just for a second, and that was enough. "Marcus," she said quietly, "the truth is already out there. The only choice you have left is whether you face it like a man or keep lying until the jury hears it instead." For a moment, she thought he might break. His shoulders slumped, his mouth opened. But then he straightened, jaw tight, and shook his head. "I've got nothing to say." And so the investigation marched on without his confession. Forensics matched the bullet to Marcus's service weapon. Blood traces, faint but undeniable, lingered in the cabin floorboards even after his frantic cleaning. Daniel's phone messages tied them together. The logbook entry placed him at the scene. Piece by piece, the image came into focus. Not just a sheriff hiding an affair, but a sheriff willing to kill to keep it buried. By the time the indictment was handed down, the town was in shock. Church sermons whispered about hypocrisy. Neighbors who once waved proudly at Marcus's patrol car now crossed the street to avoid his wife. Local news trucks camped outside the courthouse. In Fairfield County, the place that thought it knew its sheriff better than anyone, had to face the truth. Their lawman wasn't just flawed. He was a murderer. And the cabin in the woods, once a forgotten retreat, had become a monument to the darkest secret a man could keep. The courthouse in Fairfield had never seen so many cameras. News vans lined the square, satellite dishes sprouting like weeds, reporters shouting into microphones while townspeople gathered just to watch. The sight was surreal. Sheriff Marcus Langford, the man who'd once walked these halls in full uniform, now marched in wearing an orange jumpsuit, wrists shackled, eyes fixed on the ground. For 20 years, he'd been the face of authority. Today, he was the accused. Inside the courtroom, the air buzzed with tension. Journalists filled the first 2 rows, notebooks ready. Family members of Daniel Reyes sat huddled together, their grief raw and visible. Ruth Langford, Marcus's wife, appeared only once during the pre-trial hearings, veiled in a black shawl, her face pale and drawn. After that, she stopped coming. Rumors spread she'd left town to stay with her daughter. The prosecution wasted no time laying out the case. Assistant District Attorney Paul Whitman stood tall, his voice echoing across the wooden panels. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, "this case is about betrayal. Betrayal of trust, betrayal of the badge, and betrayal of a man who only wanted to live and love freely." Sheriff Marcus Langford had a choice. Instead of facing the truth, he chose to silence it with a bullet. The state's evidence was damning. The trail camera images showing Marcus's SUV at the cabin the night Daniel vanished. The cabin logbook, signed in his own hand. Text messages between Daniel and Dim, culminating in the final meeting. Forensic evidence. Blood trapped in the cabin floorboards. Residue matching Marcus's service weapon. The bullet recovered from Daniel's chest, a perfect ballistic match. Piece by piece, Whitman painted a portrait of a man so desperate to protect his reputation that he killed to keep his secret hidden. The defense tried to strike back. Marcus's attorney, a seasoned local named Richard Glenn, leaned hard on his client's decades of service. "This is a man who's kept our county safe for over 20 years, he told the jury. A man with no history of violence outside the line of duty. The state wants you to believe he threw it all away in a moment of panic. But what's more likely? That Marcus Langford, pillar of this community, suddenly became a cold-blooded killer? Or that the evidence is circumstantial, manipulated to fit a narrative that sells headlines?" But the cracks showed. When the defense called character witnesses, old friends, fellow officers, most avoided eye contact, their praise lukewarm. The weight of the evidence was too heavy. Then came the testimony that silenced the room. Detective Carla Hughes. She walked to the stand in a crisp blazer, her badge clipped to her belt, and swore in with steady eyes. She laid out every step of the investigation. The phone records, the camera footage, the smell at the shed, the discovery of Daniel's body. When the defense tried to trip her up, suggesting she had a personal grudge against the sheriff, Carla didn't flinch. "My only loyalty is to the truth," she said firmly. And the truth is, all the evidence pointed to Sheriff Langford. The gallery murmured, the words landing like a gavel strike. Perhaps the most haunting moment came when Daniel's sister took the stand. She described the last phone call she'd shared with her brother, how he sounded hopeful but nervous. She read his final text aloud, the one sent hours before his death. "We need to talk. Tonight. Cabin." Her voice broke, tears streaming down her cheeks, and jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Throughout it all, Marcus sat motionless. His once commanding presence had shrunk. The broad shoulders slumped, the jawline slack. Sometimes he whispered to his lawyer, sometimes he stared at the floor. Only once did his mask crack, when a crime scene photo of Daniel's body was displayed on the projector. Marcus's lips trembled, his eyes glistening, but he quickly turned away. The trial lasted 3 weeks, but the verdict felt inevitable long before the end. On the final day, the jury filed back into the courtroom after only 6 hours of deliberation. The foreman, a gray-haired retired teacher, read aloud. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Marcus Langford, guilty. Gasps rippled through the room. Daniel's family clutched each other, sobbing quietly. Reporters bolted for the doors to call in the headline. Marcus closed his eyes, shoulders sagging, the weight of the word crashing over him. At sentencing, Judge William Denton delivered a stern rebuke. You, Sheriff Langford, were entrusted with the highest duty in this county. Instead, you abused that power, not only to deceive but to destroy. You robbed a man of his life and this community of its faith. For that, there could be no leniency. The sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sheriff who once shook hands at parades, who lectured children on honesty, who campaigned on morality, was led from the courtroom in shackles. The image burned itself into Fairfield's collective memory, the badge replaced by a prison number, the lawman now just another inmate. Outside, microphones crowded Daniel's sister as she spoke through her tears. My brother wasn't secret. He wasn't shame. He deserved to live and love without fear. And for that, he paid with his life. In the weeks that followed, the town remained divided. Some residents whispered sympathy for Marcus, calling him a victim of his own fear, of a society that punished men like him for being who they were. Others saw no tragedy in it, only hypocrisy. He preached morality while living a lie, one churchgoer muttered. Then he killed to keep it quiet. Either way, the damage was done. Fairfield County had lost its sheriff, its illusion of certainty. The cabin in the woods, once forgotten, was now a landmark of shame. And Marcus Langford, once the embodiment of order, was now the cautionary tale whispered to newcomers. Even the man who wears the badge can harbor secrets dark enough to kill. When the verdict was read and the cameras pulled away, Fairfield County was left with something harder to process than headlines: the silence that follows when trust is shattered. For years, people had waved to Sheriff Marcus Langford as he drove down Main Street. Parents told their children he was the man to run to if they were ever in danger. His fall didn't just stain his name. It cracked the foundation of what a community believed about itself. In the weeks after the trial, the courthouse lawn became a place of uneasy pilgrimage. Strangers left flowers for Daniel Reyes, sometimes with handwritten notes. You deserved better. One note simply read, "Love shouldn't cost your life." Candles flickered at night, glowing against the courthouse steps where Marcus had once given speeches about morality. Local churches struggled to make sense of it. Some preachers called Marcus a hypocrite, a wolf in sheep's clothing who had used faith as a mask. Others, more quietly, admitted that perhaps the tragedy spoke to something deeper, the crushing weight of shame, the way secrecy corrodes the soul. Congregations split down the middle, members arguing in fellowship halls about whether Marcus was purely a monster or also a victim of a world that gave him no safe place to live honestly. For Daniel's family, grief was tangled with anger. His sister gave interviews, her voice steady even as her eyes filled with tears. My brother wasn't hiding because he wanted to, she said. He was hiding because people like Marcus told him he had to. And when Daniel wanted to live out loud, it cost him everything. Her words traveled beyond Fairfield, landing on national talk shows and podcasts. Daniel's story became a rallying cry, his name trending with hashtags like hashtag Justice for Daniel and hashtag Secrets Kill. Inside prison, Marcus faded quickly from the public stage. Gone was the pressed uniform, the polished boots, the commanding voice. Inmates called him sheriff, at first, half mocking, half aware of who he used to be. But soon, he was just another man in orange, eating meals off plastic trays, sleeping on a thin mattress under buzzing fluorescent lights. He kept to himself, head down, rarely speaking unless spoken to. The authority that once shielded him was gone, replaced by the same bars he used to lock others behind. Reporters occasionally requested interviews, but Marcus declined them all. The only words that slipped out came in a letter Ruth received months later. In uneven handwriting, he wrote, "I never wanted it to end this way. I thought I was protecting what we built. In the end, I destroyed it." Ruth never replied. She filed for divorce quietly, her lawyer noting irreconcilable differences. Fairfield eventually elected a new sheriff, a younger deputy who promised transparency and reform. But the scars lingered. For years, townsfolk would lower their voices when driving past the cabin, now boarded up and locked tight. Some wanted it demolished, erased from memory. Others insisted it should stand, a reminder of what happens when truth is buried too long. The story reached beyond Fairfield, too. True crime shows dissected every twist. Podcast hosts debated whether Marcus's actions were driven by fear, by rage, or by the rod of hypocrisy. Viewers argued online. Was he a man trapped by his era's prejudice, or simply a selfish killer? The debate only amplified the central tragedy, that Daniel's life, his laughter, his dreams of something simple and honest had been cut short because someone else chose lies over courage. Years later, a plaque was placed quietly in the town square. It bore Daniel's name, along with a single line, "May we never again let fear silence love." The dedication was small, attended mostly by Daniel's family and a handful of townspeople who believed remembrance mattered. No official spoke. No reporters covered it. But for those who came, it was a step toward healing. For Fairfield, the lesson hung heavy. It wasn't just about a sheriff's downfall or a lover's death. It was about the way secrets eat through walls until nothing's left standing. It was about how the image of perfection, held too tightly, can turn deadly when threatened. And as one true crime podcast summed it up, the tragedy of Fairfield wasn't just that a sheriff killed his lover. It was that the sheriff killed the only person who ever truly saw him. And in doing so, he revealed the lie he'd lived all along. So the cabin still stands, weathered by rain and time, a forgotten building in the woods. But for those who know the story, it will never be just a cabin. It will always be the place where fear triumphed over love, where power collapsed into violence, and where the sheriff who preached morality finally met the truth he couldn't outrun. And maybe that's the hardest part. Not the crime itself, but the reflection it forces on all of us. Because at its core, this isn't just a story about a sheriff. It's a story about what happens when fear of exposure becomes stronger than the courage to live honestly. And in Fairfield County, they'll never forget the night their lawman became a killer, and a hidden affair turned into a lesson written in blood.